Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Ross Anderson calling from Cambridge. I'm sorry about the glitch, but initially the thing didn't work in Firefox and I had to fire up Safari and get instructions from Carlos on how to get it going. So how do we take it from here? I'm not going to hear anybody, am I?
No.
Okay, so the first question we've got reading off the other screen is the section 5.5 regarding privacy salience. So what are the thoughts regarding the possibility that various service providers, social networking sites, software development corporations, etc., would ever make privacy salient to their users? Well, there were a couple of my research students, Joe Bonneau and Jonathan Anderson, studied this about 5 years ago. And at that time, there were still something like 40 social networking sites in existence. And they found that there was a very striking pattern. So what are the thoughts regarding the possibility that various service providers, social net, and okay, I had feedback there, so I had to mute the thing. And what they discovered was that regardless of which social networking site you looked at, there were several features that were common to all of them. First, none of them made privacy salient on their website. So despite much whinging from lawmakers, nobody would put a link to the privacy policy on the front page. But they would see to it that it was fairly easily findable if you looked for it a bit. The third thing that you found is that if you started to read the privacy policy, it would start off with reassuring words, and all the heavy stuff, the legalese in capital letters, would be right down at the bottom, which you'd only get to find if you persisted and went through. And so the conclusion that our students came to was that the social networking sites deliberately decided that they wanted to not make privacy salient, so that most people would never get worried about it, that they'd see to it that there was easy reassurance for people who made only a cursory check to see whether there was a privacy policy, but that privacy fundamentalists, people who would read the privacy policy to the very end, would basically be put off. They'd find eventually that the social networking site said, "You have no privacy, get over it," or words to that effect. And so they saw this in terms of a kind of triage. The privacy fundamentalists you don't want on your website because they'll just hack everybody else off. And the great majority who don't care, you don't want to disturb them. And the people who are slightly concerned should get some reassurance. Now, was this something that anybody ever planned, or was it something that just arose out of competitive action in the market? Well, at the time, 5 to 10 years ago, you had a large number of social networking sites competing for mind share and market share, and the majority of them were located around the South Bay area. So no doubt they were all copying each other. So could you make something like that happen by means of policy or regulation? Well, the problem with that is that it takes something like 15 years for a government to get its act together on a new policy. The classic example here is what happened when Microsoft killed Netscape in 1995. Microsoft had proposed a deal to Netscape under which Netscape would provide the browser and would get the client end of the market, while Microsoft would provide the web server software and would thus clean up from the business customers that had by then become its bread and butter. And Mark Andreessen and his colleagues turned them down flat, and so Bill Gates just decided to slay them in the market by bundling Internet Explorer with every copy of Windows. And in the end, Netscape really went flat. And so the European Union opened a competition policy inquiry, and it was just over 15 years before they finally got through to a decision saying that in Europe, Microsoft has to offer every new user of Windows a randomized choice of default browser. The reason it takes so long, well, lots of people have talked and written about this, If you're going to get judicial action, then of course a big and well-resourced defendant will go through every possible avenue of appeal, one after another. And if you're talking about political action by elected officials, then typically power has to change a couple of times before policy will change. Governments tend to be very rigid on policies once they've been elected. And they say policy has no reverse gear. You can start to sell an idea to an opposition because they've not got much else to do except speak to NGOs, lobbyists, academics, and so on while they're out of office. And they can then start harrying the government of the day. But when they get into government, they're going to be nervous about doing anything that might be too radical. And meanwhile, the first government has a term in opposition, and they can start thinking seriously about the issues that were debated during the previous parliament. And so eventually, after 2 parliaments or 2 congresses, you can see action on something. Now, that's perhaps fair enough in slow-moving policy areas, social policy, environmental policy, whatever. But in IT, it's rather difficult because our industry has got 15-month product cycles. Applications of what we've learned to the security software selling process. Well, security software selling is a complicated business, and it's something that was there at the beginning of security economics, because one of the questions that particularly interested Hal, but also interested me, is why did people spend apparently less than socially optimal amounts of money on security software? And one of the answers was that the damage against which you are defending if you run antivirus software on your PC is not damage to you, it's damage to others. If your PC is infected, it may be used to send spam, or it may be recruited to a botnet. And usually it won't harm you directly, at least in the beginning. Eventually, of course, you may be blacklisted. So there's a disconnect there. There are also various other disconnects. There's the issue of asymmetric information, in that most people can't tell the difference between good security software and bad security software. And so the people who pile it high and sell it cheap tend to end up acquiring market share. The third factor is that an awful lot of security software sales are bundled with new PCs. People get free antivirus for the first year, and they're then hassled to pay money or upgrade, and they can't be bothered. It would probably be better if vendors supplied everybody with free software and monetize it in other ways, but that's not how the market works. So there's all sorts of things wrong with the security software selling business. Now, various vendors have tried to do stuff about this, and various other players too. There was, I mentioned, I believe, the paper by Karl Landwehr that was about 30 years ago, saying how the security market didn't work well for the US Department of Defense. The Department of Defense wanted to buy more secure multi-level systems, but the commercial industry most of the time wasn't bothered because the numbers weren't great enough. And so there was a report written on that that basically didn't go very far. There was the Blue Book scheme that was set up so that people could go and get their software and their systems approved for government purchase. But that was slow, and you ended up having a small number of systems approved that would then be sold only in very small numbers at large amounts of money. You then had, after it was agreed that that was simply too slow and expensive, you moved to the Common Criteria scheme. And under the Common Criteria scheme, what happens is that vendors themselves go to a commercial licensed evaluation facility, and they pay money, perhaps $100,000 or so, to have their system or their software evaluated. The problem there is that the people who get evaluations under the Common Criteria tend to be either people who are selling stuff to the government, or people who have got some due diligence reason to want to say, our software is secure. An example is bank cards and some of the associated equipment. Even there, however, there are problems, as we saw with the case, that the certificational failures happen with pin entry devices. And so by and large, I tend to take the view, and this is also in the book, that most of the people who go for common criteria evaluation are people who are trying to dodge responsibility in some way, or to tick a box which enables them to push liability onto somebody else. How do business buyers behave? Well, how I behaved 25, 30 years ago when I was working in banking was as an informed skeptic. We'd have one security salesman after another come through the door trying to sell us stuff, and I would point out that their stuff didn't work or didn't do what we wanted, and we would end up not buying stuff from them. What would then happen sometimes is that the security salesman, if he was from a big powerful company, would get his boss to go and play golf with the bank's CEO and cause trouble that way. So there's all the politics that you can get in sales from one big company to another. Nowadays, what I gather is that very much of the market in selling security software to big companies is driven by compliance. And so things like Sarbanes-Oxley, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, in Europe, for example, there's data protection, and there's the idea that you can get away with data breaches provided that you have got encryption in use on the laptops of, that your staff leave on trains or planes or whatever. This drives companies to go and buy encryption software and install it as standard on laptops. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because the stolen laptop may have a weak password, or it may be configured in such a way that the thief can use it without having to enter a password, but nonetheless this is compliance driven. Speaking to people in the banking sector, nowadays there's a huge amount of compliance involved in processing things like payments, and so this is a difficult and complex market. There are no silver bullets, and if you want to sell something, selling it into a highly regulated, compliance-driven market is not always the best thing for a startup to do. Now, there are some security startups that have made good. Encipher here in Cambridge, for example, pioneered new markets for hardware security modules during the dot-com boom, when all of a sudden lots of companies wanted not just security, but processing capacity and doing SSL TLS. But that is perhaps the exception rather than the rule. We know of other startups that have succeeded selling authentication tokens to banks, for example, but by and large, selling into heavily regulated and compliance-driven markets is a hard job. Next question I have is, what measures can users take to make more secure decisions? So many of the solutions that were discussed were targeted towards actions that companies, the government, and other authorities can take. I can see that the European population does not like impositions unless they are more strict on how their services should be delivered. So how should users foster a more secure environment? I think the problem here is that most ordinary users just take the defaults that are offered to them. There's a huge amount of research in behavioral economics and elsewhere to the effect that defaults are extraordinarily powerful. And you could always read Sunstein and Thaler's book Nudge about this. There are departments of both the American government and the British government which are devoted to improving policy by offering people the defaults which are socially optimal. So that, for example, if you go and get a job with a company and the company offers a pension scheme to its employees, you should then be enrolled in that pension scheme by default and allowed to opt out if you wish, rather than simply being given the opportunity to opt into the scheme. Because it's been found that the act of walking across the yard to the HR department to either opt in or opt out is too much for many people. And so if you have a default that people are in the scheme, most people will join it. And if you're a default that most people start outside the scheme and have to opt in, then most people will be outside it. Now, exactly the same principle works in security. Most users aren't going to care very much about security unless something bad happens, unless there's a flashbulb incident in the press, or unless something unpleasant happens to somebody they know. And so what you're going to find is that the majority of people will go with defaults. Now, this can change slowly over time, and there is some interesting work by Alessandra Kisti at CMU pointing out the behavior of CMU students to Facebook over the last 7 or 8 years. Now, roughly once a year, Facebook reorganizes its privacy controls, and it does this so that it can basically zeroize everything and set everybody back to the default where all their stuff is available and visible to advertisers. And each time they do this, people who care about privacy go and learn the new privacy controls and opt out. And so when you graph the number of people who are applying privacy controls in Facebook, it's a sawtooth curve. It goes like this. You know, people learn to apply privacy controls, they get opted back in, more apply privacy controls, and over time, the direction of travel of the graph is up. So with each run round this cycle, Mark Zuckerberg is training more and more of his users that privacy is something they should care about and opt out. But nonetheless, the majority of people still go with defaults. So when you ask, should users become more educated on security issues, there's an issue here about who's going to do the educating. Now, I've been at one conference after another where people from banking industry, government, whatever, have stood up and said there should be more security education of users. And this is usually an excuse for not doing anything. It's an excuse for saying, well, if people get ripped off, then that's their fault, so they should take more care. This is an understandable position for a government minister to take if he doesn't want to get into fights with powerful interests like Google or Facebook or the banking industry or whatever. But it's nonetheless slightly dishonest, because if web service firms like Facebook are, for their own commercial reasons, going to make privacy not salient, if they're going to train people to click on links in emails, for example, because that's how marketing is done, if they're going to train people to do other things that are dubious from a security point of view, then they have got so much more power and influence over user behavior than any conceivable government campaign in peacetime. And so you would end up with a situation whereby the service companies were in effect spending billions of dollars a year on training users to behave insecurely, and governments would then, if you like, provide a fig leaf by supplying a few millions or a few tens of millions of dollars worth of ads to tell users that they were being stupid in doing that. And I don't think you have to analyze this very deeply to realize that this is something that the web service firms might like. If they can maximize their profits by getting people to behave insecurely, and then get governments to blame people for the resulting losses, then we end up actually worse than we would have been had governments simply kept their mouth shut and not done any education at all. So that's one of the interesting problems here. It's tied in, of course, with the privacy paradox, the fact that most people say that they care about privacy, but in practice behave entirely otherwise. And there are a number of explanations offered for this. I've reckoned for many years that a large part of it is simply a matter of education and catch-up. Guys like me who understand a bit about the bad things that can go online tend to set defaults on my system to be fairly strict. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why it was difficult to get this session going in my normal browser. But most people, of course, don't want to have this hassle. They just simply want stuff to work in their browser. They go with the default. If the bank trains them to click on links in emails, then they'll click on links in emails and then they get phished. And the bank says, sorry, that's your fault. And to my way of thinking, that's a bit unjust. Should user interfaces be enhanced to help users spot danger themselves? Well, indeed so. But who is going to be the regulator? At the first workshop in security and human behavior in Boston in 2008, we had the psychologist Nick Humphrey, who summed up the last session rather nicely. He said, "We seem to have agreed," he said, "that people worry far too much about terrorism and not anything like enough about cybercrime. And if you want people to worry less about terrorism, then that's easy. You could take all the men with machine guns out of the airports and you could put in nice, comfortable sofas and you could have Mozart playing on the loudspeakers. Then people would relax a lot more when they're flying and they wouldn't worry so much about, you know, Al-Qaeda and all that crowd. And if you want people to worry more about cybercrime," he said, "well, then that's the fault of the computer industry. The computer industry spends billions of pounds trying to make computers not scary. Back in the 1970s, when he and I were learning to program, computers were scary. They were big grey metal boxes. They were attended by men in white coats. You had to get special training before you could write a program and submit it. There were all sorts of rituals around it. You know, you were clearly doing something very, very special if you wrote a program for a computer and used it. Nowadays, we've had computers being made friendly in every conceivable way. We have computers called pets. You've got computers that you carry around in your pocket as phones. And a huge amount of marketing muscle has gone into making us feel perhaps a little bit more at home with our computers than reason dictates. So, said Nick, the solution is simple. Just pass a law saying that everybody's got to use a JAWS picture as a screensaver. That way, they'll realize that they ought to be afraid, that they ought to be at least a little bit afraid. The problem is, however, that the industry isn't going to let you put JAWS in as a screensaver because that will eat into their profits. And government is not going to be that willing to remove all the scary stuff from airports, because scary stuff makes people patriotic. It makes them more likely to vote for the government of the day. You know, wave the flag, vote for the prime minister or president or whoever. And so you end up having inappropriate psychological cues being offered to people for perfectly understandable political or business reasons. And that's why doing security is something where the engineering, the psychology, and the economics all come together. Let me look at the other screen and see what the next question. Should users track their activity to find inconsistencies? Well, indeed, there are a number of frauds and other things that you will discover when you come across an inconsistency. And the obvious bad thing that happens is that you discover a transaction on your bank statement or your credit card statement that you don't recall making. That's how many of us realize that something bad has gone wrong online, that you made a transaction that you thought you were making to Amazon or your local store or whatever, and actually your credit card got stolen by the bad guys. Or you thought you were making down payments on a car, and instead the bad guys took over your bank credentials and sent all your money to somewhere in a less developed country. But there's a limit to how much you can do this, because tracking, for example, the network in your company or your university and looking for inconsistencies there that are at the sign of an attack is something that requires people who are skilled in networking. So there's only so much can be done at every level. Now, one of the interesting things is the extent to which you can make trust functions self-policing, in the sense that failures are evident. Let me give you an example. If you've got a traffic cop of the kind that we used to see 20 years ago, a policeman standing in a box at the middle of a street junction, waving the cars on this way and that way, then everybody can see instantly whether he's doing his job well or not. Because if he screws up, then the traffic comes grinding to a halt. And one of the problems that we have with stuff online is that we've got a relative shortage of sources of trust which are designed to be self-limiting. Because when people offer a trust service, they try and make it as universal as possible with a view to getting the network effects, getting a dominant position, and acquiring as much power as possible so they can make as much money as possible. So this is another open security economics problem that I'll be speaking about at a workshop next month. How do you go about defeating the security economics of the social aspects of trust. One example here is, think of the ancient Greek gods, for example. The Greek gods had power in proportion to the number of people who prayed to them. If everybody believed in, Zeus, then Zeus was clearly powerful, but if people preferred to believe in Hephaestus instead, then that went the other way. You may think of the pantomime where the fairy Tinkerbell is about to disappear because not enough kids believe in fairies anymore. Trust is to a certain extent like that. And of course, the incentive on the trust service provider is to make your trust service too popular to fill. If your trust service is someone like VeriSign or Komodo, which very large numbers of websites use for certification, then even if you get hacked by the Iranian secret police, Firefox isn't going to remove your certificates from its browser because that would break simply too much. What do you do when banks charge you twice for the same thing? You have to go and complain. Well, that's a regulatory failure, which thankfully is still limited to only a few countries. But there is a risk that as technology spreads chip and pin throughout the world, that more and more countries will start being tempted to go down the route that at present is followed by countries like Spain and the UK and South Africa, where the customer is generally held to be liable because it's asserted that if the card and PIN were used, then the customer must have authorized the transaction or at least been grossly negligent. Really, really interesting to see whether banks in the States start using this argument that disputed transactions were actually authorized and therefore the customer is being wicked in disputing them. And we've noted one or two signs of banks in the USA changing their terms and conditions so that they might be in a position to start running that argument with their customers and escaping the Regulation E and Regulation Z that have so far forced them to behave. Should users be informed periodically on the state of their information and what it was used for? Well, yes, there are some applications where this is really, really very important. And about 3 weeks ago, there was a report published by the Nuffield Bioethics Council in the UK, of which I was one of about a dozen authors, on what happens to medical ethics in a world of cloud-based medical records and pervasive genomics. The situation here is that until quite recently, if you went and told your doctor that you had, some embarrassing lump on your behind, then that got written down in his records and stayed as a secret between you and him. But as records go online, so it becomes possible for medical insurers in the USA or the National Health Service in the UK to harvest millions of people's records and then mine them for stuff of interest and value. And the first thing, of course, that's done is to mine these for medical research, and the second thing that's done is to mine them for ways in which the administration can be improved. And then the third thing to which people's minds turn is how they can be sold for profit. And we had a big scandal in the UK back in March 2014, when it turned out that copies of our hospital records had been sold by the government to over 1,000 different actors worldwide. And so this raises the question of how you can do medical ethics in a world where data sets become large and the actors who've got access to these data sets, like governments, are not always the easiest to keep under control. The conclusion that we came to is that you needed a fourfold approach to this, that if you are a bona fide researcher, say you're a professor in a university, and you want to use statistical analysis of medical records in order to examine some hypothesis, say, the effects of taking aspirin on the survival of patients with rheumatism or whatever, then the four things that you should do is, firstly, remember that you're dealing with patient records and treat people with respect. So the fact that the patients are people, and this is information that they've supplied in the context of their healthcare, should be one of the things that's foremost in your mind. You should not treat medical records as an industrial raw material, like coal or potatoes. The second thing you have to do is be sure that you obey all the relevant data protection and human rights laws, because that's the outcome of the long process of consultation that we've had in our society about how issues such as privacy should be dealt with. The third thing that you have to deal with is be open about what you plan to do. And this means that if you're going to be doing a research project, you should not merely be doing a small consultation that's hardly visible, but consult all the affected stakeholders, or if that isn't going to be practical, then representative groups of stakeholders. And if you've got the context of, say, a national biobank project where you've got 300,000 volunteers giving their records and giving blood samples so that researchers can use their records and their outcomes and genetic material in order to investigate diseases, then you should have proper mechanisms to do that, regular email newsletters or whatever. And finally, you have to be open about what you actually have done. And that means that you should not only be open about things like research results, but you also have to be really, really strict on things like security breach disclosure. And so if some member of staff ran off with a few thousand patient records, the last thing that you should do is cover that up. The fact that there was a breach should be disclosed and made clear to patients, and you should apologize for it and so on and so forth. Because otherwise what's going to happen is the fact that there was a breach will be disclosed by some insider, some future whistleblower, and then public confidence in the system will be lost. And the reason this is important in medical research is that if the public loses faith in medical research, then they'll stop collaborating with projects such as Biobank, and they may start opting out of letting their records be used for research in appreciable numbers. And there are places such as Iceland in the late 1990s where this actually happened. Finally, is giving more power and authority to users the right path to better security, or are they just too indifferent to actually make a difference? Well, if you've got a system in which it makes sense for a user to control their information, or for someone to control the information on their behalf, then by all means go for it. In the old days, your medical records were controlled by your GP, and your interest in privacy was aligned with his interest in professional autonomy. But centralization completely undermined that. And the average individual is not realistically in a position to have power and authority over what happens with information in complex modern healthcare systems. So what you have to do is set up the controls that are feasible. For example, you may have to have separate controls at the general practice and at the hospital, so that when someone goes to a general practice, they've got the ability to opt out of having their records used in research. And similarly, when they go for hospital treatment, there should be some way that they can opt out there. If you have got centralized mechanisms for this, then that may bring some possible advantages. But with attempts to set this up in the UK, what we've seen in practice is that opt-outs from our National Health Service have become a little bit like the opt-outs from Facebook that I mentioned earlier. That every year or so they change all the systems and they force everybody to opt out all over again using complex and difficult to use mechanisms. And clearly they're doing it for the same kind of reason that Facebook does. So giving power and authority to users, it's a nice idea when you can make it work, but often the nature of the system and the nature of the power relationships between the various players in the system is going to make that difficult. So the future for privacy is a difficult one. I don't believe that you can have a single silver bullet to this. And in particular, it might be interesting for students in this course to look at the PCAST report. That's the Presidential Council of Advisors in Science and Technology. This includes senior people from Microsoft, Google, and so on, under the aegis of the National Academy of Sciences in the USA. And they produced a report last year that was blessed by President Obama, which said roughly as follows: that big data systems consist of data collection systems, data aggregation systems, and then systems that use the data. So you can think, for example, if you go and buy a teddy bear for your kid. And teddy bears are starting to come with systems that will do speech and gesture recognition. This is all the rage. And very often this means sending the data to a cloud service to be analyzed, because that means that the battery in the teddy bear lasts longer. So you end up with a camera and a microphone in your kid's bedroom that's reporting what's going on to a data center somewhere in Oregon. And this information is then aggregated, and it's analyzed, and it's sold on to people for use in marketing operations of various kinds. Now, the PCAST report says you shouldn't have any restrictions on data collection, they said, because there are too many firms do it, so you can't practically do that. There shouldn't be any restrictions on data aggregation because that's inconvenient, and the only restriction should be on the end use of the data. Now, I don't think that that's an acceptable view. Of course, it's the view of certain segments of US industry, but I think it's failing in your duties as a parent if you're going to have microphones and cameras sitting in your kid's bedroom that are sending the data to goodness knows where you can't control it. Also, where governments for their own purposes are doing data aggregation, for example in intelligence and law enforcement, they see to it that the various collections of data are kept separate as appropriate. And then there are controls on the use of data too, so that only officials with the appropriate security clearances and code words and so on are allowed to see the signals intelligence product, on what's happening in Chile or what's happening in China or what have you. So in practice, in the world in the future, we're going to have to see to it that where we can, we've got controls on collection, controls on aggregation, controls in use. There also have to be rights for individuals so that people who are wronged can seek redress from the appropriate player in this game. And one very interesting point to note is that less than a week after the PCAST report came out, the European Court of Justice in the Gonzalez case decided that someone whose privacy was being violated had a right of action not just against a newspaper that carried information that they considered to be hurtful or defamatory, but also against Google for indexing that information. And so in Europe, at least, the established law now is that you have rights against data aggregators as well as data collectors, and presumably against data users. So this is going to be a very, very interesting policy area over the years to come, and I'm sure it's going to remain a live area where people who understand the engineering of these systems are in a constant give and take with people who do the policy, and security economics is going to be at the center of this conversation. So that seems to have brought us to the just about the end of our period. Let me just see if we've got any more messages coming in. But in the absence of that, one message, is that relevant? That's just a link. Okay, well in that case, many thanks for tuning in. I'm sorry we were late, this is the world of computers, I'm afraid, and where computers and privacy mix and people start changing defaults, then stuff breaks. But I trust you've enjoyed the course, and I hope you found it useful. Cheers.